Carl, as I stated, the full testimony of all the witnesses will be made part of the record. Does the ranking member have a unanimous consent request?
Yes, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, be authorized to sit for the purpose of questioning witnesses during the hearing.
I have no objection, but in the interest of fiscal austerity, can we start charging him rent for all the time he spends here with us?
Given that he's from Texas, I'm sure he can accommodate you. I'm prepared. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That objection, so ordered. Mr. Braun, regarding the Quds Force, and as I said, the title of the hearing was Iran and Hezbollah, but actually, of course, any offshoots, any variations of that, also part of the scope of the hearing. Do you believe that the IRGC would be able to leverage the existing Hezbollah network that operates in this country to potentially conduct a terror operation?
Well, if their past track record, receives any weight whatsoever, then I would say yes. It's what they do. The Quds Force helped stand up Hezbollah many years ago. Where you find one, no matter where you go in the world, where you find one, you most assuredly find the other. I'm told that DEA agents and other investigators are routinely bumping into both of these threats as they're looking are focused on criminal investigations, working with counterparts in austere places like the Macron Coast and the tri-border of South America, certainly in West Africa and North Africa. As I said, both of these groups, their modus operandi is to identify existing illicit infrastructures and to leverage and exploit them for everything that they're worth. Congressman King, I would say, the answer to that is absolutely yes. They would tap into it. And if I could just mention one other thing, listen, I retired from DEA in late 2008. And like Chris and Dr. Call, I no longer, I don't speak for DEA. I don't no longer speak for our government, but I am a concerned citizen. What I can tell you is what I was saying as I was had one foot in the door and one foot out the door in 2008 was there was a growing concern on my part that there was no doubt Hezbollah, had become heavily involved in the global cocaine trade, moving tons of the stuff out of the Andean region into West Africa, onward into Europe, and they're obviously making hundreds of millions of dollars a year behind that activity. But what concerned me most is there was clear evidence, there were signs that caused me to believe that Quds Force might actually be directing and managing the Hezbollah's illicit cocaine trafficking, their operations.
Based on your DEA experience, were you surprised or not surprised in the unraveling of the plot back in October where the Iranians were going to use drug cartels to carry out the assassination?
No, sir, I'm not. I mean, it's something that I've been preaching for a long time. I've talked with you and professional members of your staff as well as other members of this distinguished committee. I've talked with many of you over the years and your professional staff members, and I think you all know that I've been talking about this for a long time. This growing confluence of drugs and terror, well over half of the 50 designated terrorist organizations that we have identified or so designated formally are now involved in one or more aspects of the global drug trade, and this, quite honestly, is a byproduct of our success in prosecuting the global war on terrorism. State sponsorship in a large way, generally speaking, has declined, and we have significantly impacted and identified the funding streams to these groups from very powerful private donors. So these groups, if they want to keep their movements alive, are having to do other things to generate revenue. And they're turning to contraband revenue.
Okay. If I could ask the staff to put back the photos that we had of the terrorists or the Hezbollah operatives in Charlotte who were actually trained. Was this unusual? I mean, from your work on the case, was it unusual for these operatives to be terror trained, or was it your impression that that was not uncommon for Hezbollah operatives? I mean, were these the exception?
I don't think it was anyone that was working the case thought it was unusual. These were things that we found during searches and were later used as trial exhibits. But to see them on the rooftops with, rockets and AK-47s was, we felt like vindication that we were going after a terrorist organization, not just a criminal group. And it was it could very quickly morph into something else. We saw that level of commitment. We saw that inspirational material, pictures of suicide bombers marching in review, death to America, death to Israel. All that propaganda was present during the searches and introduced at the trial.
Now, I had said in my opening statement that in conversations which a number of you had with our staffs and also with other conversations we've had with people in the intelligence community, they put the number at least the hundreds of Hezbollah operatives in this country. Does anyone dispute that? Is that too high? Is that too low?
I couldn't put an exact number on it. I do know that the 20 cases that you mentioned are only those cases where there's a direct nexus to Hezbollah mentioned in an indictment. There are many more cases out there being investigated and many more that have been prosecuted where there's a nexus, but it was much easier just to charge criminal indictment, not go through the whole process of using intelligence information in a criminal trial, which is a little bit cumbersome.
Mr. Silva, does that number sound real to you, the hundreds?
Yeah, obviously our focus is on New York City and we only see a piece of the pie, but if you can extrapolate those numbers, it certainly seems like a reasonable count.
Mr. Braun?
I would say yes, and let me just mention one thing with respect to the LCB or the Lebanese-Canadian Bake investigation that the DEA led and worked with the Department of Treasury on. There were over 70 used car dealerships that were identified as part of the money laundering scheme for laundering the hundreds of millions of dollars of cocaine-generated revenue, much of which was tracked back to Hezbollah. What concerns me, Congressman, of all those used car dealerships that were involved in that thing, I ask a question. When the number was much lower, at about 35 or 40, I said, how many of those businesses? I asked our investigators, how many of those businesses existed pre 9/11 versus post 9/11? The answer was absolutely none. So if
I'm going to get you. Time is running over, so I'll have to.
Okay.
Dr. Levitt. Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay. Dr. Levitt.
I think the number changes. It fluctuates. It's a significant number, but I also warn people that counting known Hezbollah operatives, for example, doesn't capture the whole picture. There is a spectrum of sympathy, support, and then trained operatives. And as I was getting at my testimony, Hezbollah could call on any of these individuals. One of the things I get to in my written testimony is Hezbollah's ability to extort people to do things they might not otherwise want to do. And we've seen that activity in this country. As Mitch said, almost all these people have relatives back home, and that puts them in a position where they can be extorted to do things, perhaps even violent things, that they may not otherwise have wanted to do. So the numbers are more than maybe just the number of cases.
Thank you. Recognize the ranking member.